The blood-curdling scream echoed through the dusty main street of Twin Falls, Idaho, causing every head to turn toward the commotion outside the general store, where Darcy Porter stood with her hands raised defensively against her husband's approaching fist. It was the summer of 1878, and Twin Falls was experiencing one of the hottest days on record. The heat rose in waves from the dirt road, creating a hazy mirage that made the scene before Preston Nathans seem almost like a dream, but the sound of flesh striking flesh told him it was anything but. Preston had only been in town for 3 days, having ridden in from Montana after a long cattle drive. The tall, broad-shouldered cowboy had come to Twin Falls looking for work and a fresh start, not trouble. But trouble had found him anyway in the form of a woman with frightened eyes and a bruised cheek. "You worthless woman!" The man, clearly her husband, was shouting as he raised his hand again. "I told you to be quick about it. Can't even buy supplies without making a spectacle." Darcy was backing away, clutching a small parcel to her chest. Her honey-blonde hair had partially fallen from its pins, and there was a trickle of blood from her split lip. "Henry, please," she begged. "Not here." Henry Porter, a stocky man with wealth evident in his fine clothes but cruelty evident in his eyes, seemed not to care that half the town was watching. "You think I care who sees? Everyone knows a man has the right to discipline his wife." Preston had seen enough. Without thinking of the consequences, he stepped between them, his tall frame creating a solid barrier between the enraged husband and his cowering wife. "That's enough," Preston said, his voice low but firm, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. "No man has the right to treat a lady that way." Henry's face reddened with fury. "This is none of your business, cowboy. Step aside. That's my wife." "Being your wife doesn't make her your property to damage," Preston replied, not budging an inch. He could feel the woman trembling behind him, the scent of her rose-water perfume mingling with the metallic smell of her blood. "Do you know who I am?" Henry sputtered. "I own the bank in this town. I can ruin you." Preston didn't flinch. "And I don't particularly care if you own the whole territory. You're not touching her again." A crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some of the men looked uncomfortable. Women whispered behind their hands, and Sheriff Buchanan was making his way slowly up the street, his expression wary. "What's going on here?" the sheriff asked, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "This drifter is interfering in a private matter between me and my wife," Henry said, his voice dripping with authority. Darcy stepped slightly to the side, still behind Preston but now visible to the sheriff. Her face was already swelling, her blue eyes wide with fear. Sheriff Buchanan sighed, taking in the scene. "Henry, you know I can't have this kind of disturbance in the middle of town." "Then arrest this interloper," Henry demanded. The sheriff looked at Preston. "You passing through, mister?" "Was planning to stay a while," Preston replied, his eyes never leaving Henry. "Looking for ranch work." "Well," the sheriff said slowly, "why don't you come along to my office and we can talk about that? Mrs. Porter, I suggest you head on home." "She's coming with me," Henry said, reaching for Darcy's arm. Preston shifted again, blocking his reach. "I don't think that's wise right now, sir." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, unexpectedly, a woman stepped forward from the crowd. "Darcy can come with me, Sheriff," she said. "I've got a spare room at the boarding house." Mrs. Martha Wilkins was a widow who ran the only respectable boarding house in Twin Falls. Her invitation was both a lifeline and a public rebuke to Henry Porter. "Now see here," Henry began, but the sheriff cut him off. "That sounds like a fine idea, Mrs. Wilkins, just until everyone cools off." The sheriff's tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Henry looked around at the watching crowd, seeming to realize he'd lost this round. "This isn't over," he spat, then turned on his heel and stormed off toward the saloon. Darcy's legs nearly gave way beneath her as Mrs. Wilkins gently took her arm. "Thank you," she whispered to Preston, her voice barely audible. "Don't mention it, madam," he replied, tipping his hat. I'll stay right here in Twin Falls and make sure he doesn't bother you again." And in that moment, as their eyes met, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or the seed of something that neither of them could yet name. Sheriff Buchanan cleared his throat. "Let's go have that talk now, Cowboy." Preston nodded, following the lawman down the street, but not before casting one last glance at Darcy as Mrs. Wilkins led her away. In that brief look was a promise one he intended to keep. In the sheriff's office, a small building with a jail cell in the back, Preston found himself being sized up by the weathered lawman. Sheriff James Buchanan was in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that had seen their share of trouble. "You picked a dangerous man to cross," the sheriff said, settling behind his desk. "Henry Porter has a lot of influence in this town." "Didn't pick him," Preston replied, sitting in the chair offered. "I just couldn't stand by and watch." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Admirable." "Foolish, but admirable." He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove and slid one across to Preston. "Where'd you say you're from?" "Montana, most recently. Before that, Texas. Been working cattle drives since I was 16. "And you're looking for work here?" Preston nodded. "Heard the Nelson Ranch might be hiring. I'm good with horses, better with cattle." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "Nelson's a good man. Could use someone like you, but you should know Porter won't let this go. He's a proud man and you shamed him publicly." "I'm not looking for trouble," Preston said honestly, "but I won't apologize for what I did." "Didn't expect you would." The sheriff sipped his coffee. "Porter's had a reputation for some time, treats his wife poorly, but she's never pressed charges. Her father was a business partner of Porter's, arranged the marriage before he died 2 years ago, left everything to Porter, nothing to Darcy." Preston's jaw tightened. "That why she stays with him?" "That, and where would she go? Women don't have many options out here." The sheriff set down his cup. "Still, what happened today crossed a line. Beating your wife in private is one thing, law's gray on that. Doing it in the middle of town is another matter entirely. So you're saying it's acceptable as long as no one sees it?" The sheriff had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm saying the law has limits, and so do I, but Mrs. Wilkins taking her in that's new, might give Darcy some breathing room." Preston finished his coffee. "I plan to stay in Twin Falls for a while. If Porter comes after me, that's his choice." "And if he comes after his wife?" "Then I'll be there," Preston said simply. The sheriff sighed. "I figured as much. Well, Nelson's ranch is about 3 miles west of town. Tell him I sent you." He rose and extended his hand. "Preston Nathans, was it?" Preston stood and shook the offered hand. "That's right. Word of advice, Nathan's Twin Falls isn't like the bigger cattle towns. We're small, but we look after our own. Porter's been here 10 years, made a lot of friends in high places. You've been here 3 days. I understand. I hope you do." The sheriff walked him to the door. "And Nathan's? If you're going to stay right here like you promised that woman, you'd better be ready for what that means." Preston nodded, settling his hat on his head as he stepped out into the late afternoon sun. He knew exactly what it meant, and he wasn't going anywhere. At Mrs. Wilkins's boarding house, Darcy sat quietly on the edge of a narrow bed while the older woman gently cleaned the cut on her lip. The room was small but clean, with a simple quilt on the bed and curtains that fluttered in the breeze from the open window. "There we go, dear," Mrs. Wilkins said, setting aside the cloth. "It won't scar, I don't think." "Thank you," Darcy murmured, her fingers unconsciously touching her wedding ring. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did." Mrs. Wilkins sat beside her. "I've watched for too long, Darcy, we all have." Tears filled Darcy's eyes. "I don't know what to do." "For tonight, you rest. Tomorrow will sort itself out." The older woman patted her hand. That cowboy who stepped in, he seemed determined. Darcy's heart fluttered at the memory of the tall stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel. "He'll get himself killed," she whispered. "Henry has friends, important friends." "Perhaps," Mrs. Wilkins rose. "But he also looked like a man who can handle himself. Now I'll bring you some supper in a bit. Try to rest." Alone in the room, Darcy moved to the window and looked out at the town. The sun was beginning to set. casting long shadows across the buildings. Somewhere out there was Henry, undoubtedly drinking and plotting his revenge. And somewhere was the cowboy Preston she'd heard the sheriff call him, who had risked everything for a woman he didn't know. She couldn't remember the last time someone had stood up for her. Her father had been a loving but weak man who had succumbed to Henry's influence long before arranging their marriage. There had been no brothers to protect her, no friends brave enough to interfere. Henry had been charming once, or had seemed so. The cruelty had started subtly, a harsh word here, a controlling demand there. By the time it escalated to physical violence, Darcy had already been isolated, her small inheritance from her mother's side tied up in Henry's businesses, her spirit nearly broken. But today, something had changed. Not just because of the stranger's intervention, but because for the first time the town had witnessed what she endured. They had seen, and someone, Mrs. Wilkins, had finally acted. Darcy pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. What would tomorrow bring? Henry wouldn't let this humiliation stand. And the cowboy? What would become of him? She straightened her shoulders. Whatever happened, she would not be responsible for another person suffering at Henry's hands. Perhaps it was time to find courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Preston found lodging at the smaller of Twin Falls's two hotels, a modest establishment called the Frontier Inn. After securing a room, he made his way to the dining room where several other guests were eating supper. He had just begun his meal when the door opened and 3 men entered. They weren't there for food, their eyes scanned the room until they fell on Preston. The leader of the trio was a tall, thin man with a sheriff's deputy badge pinned to his vest. "You Nathans?" the deputy asked, approaching Preston's table. Preston set down his fork. I'm Deputy Warren. These are my associates, Mr. Cole and Mr. Finch." The men flanking him were clearly not law officers but looked tough enough. "Mr. Porter would like a word with you." "I'm having my supper," Preston replied calmly. "If Mr. Porter wants to talk, he can find me here after I'm done." The deputy's face hardened. It wasn't a request. Preston looked at each man in turn. "I've already spoken with Sheriff Buchanan. If Porter has a complaint, he can take it up through proper channels." "The sheriff doesn't run this town," Deputy Warren said, his hand hovering near his gun. "Men like Porter do. Now you can come along peacefully, or we can make a scene." The few other diners were watching nervously. Preston considered his options. He could fight and likely win against these 3, but that would only escalate the situation and might get innocent people hurt. "Where is Porter?" he asked. Waiting at the Silverado saloon, Preston nodded, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and stood. "Lead the way." The Silverado was the more upscale of Twin Falls's saloons, catering to businessmen rather than cowboys and miners. When Preston entered, flanked by his escorts, the piano player faltered briefly before continuing his tune. At a corner table sat Henry Porter with 2 other well-dressed men. "Mr. Nathans," Porter said as Preston approached. "Please join us." Preston remained standing. "You wanted to see me." Porter gestured to an empty chair. "Sit, have a drink, we're all civilized men here." Reluctantly, Preston sat but declined the offered whiskey. "Say your piece." Porter smiled thinly. "Direct, I appreciate that in a man." He leaned forward. "You embarrassed me today, Mr. Nathans." "In front of the whole town." "You embarrassed yourself," Preston replied, "by beating a woman in public." One of Porter's companions shifted uncomfortably, but Porter's smile didn't waver. "My wife and I had a disagreement. These things happen in marriages, not where I come from." Porter's smile faded. "Let me be clear. My wife is my concern, not yours. What happened today was unfortunate, but it's over. I'm willing to forget your interference if you leave Twin Falls by morning." "And if I don't?" Porter's eyes hardened. "Twin Falls is a small community, Mr. Nathans. We take care of our own. There won't be work for you here. There won't be a welcome. There might not even be safety." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality." Porter gestured around the saloon. "Look around. Every man of consequence in this town is either my friend, my debtor, or my business partner. The smart play is to move on." Preston studied the man before him. Henry Porter was perhaps 40, with the soft hands of someone who'd never done physical labor, but the calculating eyes of a man who knew how to get others to do his dirty work. "I came to Twin Falls looking for honest work," Preston said. "I still intend to find it. What's between you and your wife is your business until you make it public or until she asks for help." "She won't," Porter said confidently. "Darcy knows her place." Preston stood. "Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss." Porter's voice stopped him as he turned to leave. "I made my fortune foreclosing on people who made poor decisions, Nathans. Don't be one of them." Preston didn't reply as he walked out of the saloon into the night air. The threat had been clear, but so was his path forward. Tomorrow he would ride out to the Nelson Ranch and secure work, and he would keep his promise to Darcy Porter. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. Darcy woke early, her bruised face aching but her mind clearer than it had been in months. Mrs. Wilkins had already prepared breakfast, and the two women ate quietly before the older woman spoke. "Henry came by last night after you were asleep," she said. "I didn't wake you." Darcy's hand froze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What did he want? For you to come home, of course. Said it was all a misunderstanding." "And what did you tell him?" Mrs. Wilkins smiled slightly. "That my boarding house was full of gossips who would talk if his wife left in the night, and it might be better for appearances if you stayed at least until the bruises faded." Darcy set down her cup. "And he accepted that?" He didn't like it, but yes. Appearances matter greatly to Henry Porter. The older woman reached across the table and took Darcy's hand. "But this is only temporary, dear, you know that." "I know." Darcy stared out the window at the dusty street beginning to fill with morning activity. "I just need time to think." "Think about what? About what comes next?" "I can't go back to him, Mrs. Wilkins, not after yesterday. Something broke in me when he hit me in front of everyone." "Pride is a powerful thing," Mrs. Wilkins agreed. "But what will you do? Where will you go?" Darcy had been asking herself the same questions all night. "I don't know yet. I have a little money of my own that Henry doesn't know about, not much, but enough to get to Denver, maybe. I have a cousin there." Mrs. Wilkins squeezed her hand. "You know you can stay here as long as you need." "Thank you, but Henry won't allow that for long." "And I won't put you at risk." Darcy managed a small smile. "He controls too much in this town." "Not everything," Mrs. Wilkins said firmly. "Not everyone." Darcy was about to respond when a knock came at the front door. Mrs. Wilkins went to answer it, and Darcy heard the low murmur of voices before the older woman returned with Sheriff Buchanan. "Mrs. Porter," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "How are you feeling this morning?" "I've been better, Sheriff," Darcy replied, "but I'll heal." The sheriff nodded. "I've come to ask if you want to file a complaint against your husband. What he did yesterday, well, it crossed a line." Darcy stared at him in disbelief. "A complaint? Would that even matter? Henry practically owns the town." "The law is the law, Mrs. Porter, and who enforces it? You." Darcy stood, suddenly angry. "Where were you all the other times, Sheriff, when my neighbors pretended not to hear me screaming? When I came to town with bruises I couldn't hide?" The sheriff had the grace to look ashamed. "Times are changing, Mrs. Porter. What happened yesterday, it was too public to ignore. So it's not the crime that matters, but who sees it." Darcy shook her head. "No, Sheriff, I won't file a complaint that will be forgotten as soon as Henry speaks to the right people." "Darcy," Mrs. Wilkins said gently. "It's all right," the sheriff sighed. "I understand, but the offer stands if you change your mind." He settled his hat back on his head. "That cowboy Nathans, he's still in town, rode out to the Nelson place this morning looking for work." Darcy's heart skipped a beat. "He's staying in Twin Falls. Seems determined to." The sheriff moved toward the door. "Just thought you should know." After he left, Darcy returned to the window, her thoughts in turmoil. The cowboy Preston was staying because of her, because he'd promised. The knowledge warmed something inside her that had been cold for too long. "Be careful, Darcy," Mrs. Wilkins said softly. "Hope is a dangerous thing when you're trapped." "I know," Darcy replied, but she couldn't stop the small flame that had been kindled. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future. Preston rode back into Twin Falls late that afternoon, dusty but satisfied. Thomas Nelson, owner of the Circle and Ranch, had hired him on the spot after seeing him work with a particularly troublesome stallion. The pay was fair, the bunkhouse clean, and the work honest. Most importantly, it was within riding distance of Twin Falls. As he stabled his horse at the livery, Preston noticed Deputy Warren watching from across the street. The message was clear: he was being monitored. Preston tipped his hat mockingly at the deputy, who scowled and turned away. After cleaning up, Preston decided to risk a visit to Mrs. Wilkins's boarding house. He needed to know how Darcy was faring and to let her know he had secured a position nearby. As he approached the white two-story building, he saw her sitting on the front porch, a book open in her lap. She looked up as his boots sounded on the wooden walkway, and for a moment, their eyes met in silent recognition. Despite the bruising on her face, she was beautiful, delicate features, golden hair pulled back in a simple style, and blue eyes that held both wariness and warmth. "Mr. Nathans," she said, setting aside her book. "Mrs. Porter." He removed his hat. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Please." Preston sat, acutely aware of her proximity and the subtle scent of roses that seemed to surround her. "I wanted to see how you were doing." "Better, thank you." Her fingers nervously touched her bruised cheek. "And to thank you properly for what you did yesterday." "No thanks necessary, madam." "Darcy," she said softly. "Please call me Darcy." "Darcy," he repeated, liking the way her name felt on his lips. "I'm Preston." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke again. "The sheriff told me you found work at the Nelson Ranch." Preston nodded. "Started today. Mr. Nelson seems like a good man to work for." "He is," Darcy agreed. "His wife, Eleanor, is one of the few friends I have in town." She hesitated. "Preston, you should know Henry won't let this go. By staying in Twin Falls, you're putting yourself at risk. I've handled risk before. Not like this." Her blue eyes were intense. "Henry doesn't fight his own battles. He uses money, influence, and other men to get what he wants." Preston leaned forward slightly. "Darcy, I meant what I said yesterday. I'm staying right here. Not just because of Porter, but because Twin Falls seems like a place where I could build something." He paused. "And because I made a promise to you." Darcy looked away, blinking back tears. "You don't even know me." "I'd like to," he said simply. Before she could respond, the sound of an approaching carriage drew their attention. A sleek black buggy pulled by two matching bay horses came to a stop in front of the boarding house, and Henry Porter stepped down. Darcy tensed visibly, her face paling beneath the bruises. "Afternoon, Darcy," Henry called, his voice pleasant but his eyes cold as they took in Preston sitting beside his wife. "I see you have company." Preston stood as Henry climbed the steps to the porch. "Porter, Nathans." Henry turned to Darcy. "I've come to take you home, my dear. You've had your little respite." "I'm not ready to come home, Henry," Darcy said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear in her eyes. Henry's pleasant expression slipped. "This isn't a negotiation, Darcy. Get your things." "The lady said she's not ready," Preston interjected. Henry's gaze shifted to Preston, hatred naked in his eyes. "Still inserting yourself where you don't belong, Cowboy. I thought we had an understanding." "We understand each other perfectly," Preston replied, "which is why I'm still here." The tension between the two men was palpable. Henry's hand moved slightly toward his coat, where Preston suspected he carried a small pistol. Preston didn't move, but his awareness heightened, ready to react. The front door opened and Mrs. Wilkins stepped out. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" "No problem," Henry said smoothly, his hand moving away from his coat. "I was just telling my wife it's time to come home." "And I was saying I'm not ready," Darcy repeated. Mrs. Wilkins nodded. "Well, as I told you last night, Mr. Porter, Darcy is welcome to stay as long as she likes." Dr. Mills recommended at least a week of rest after examining her this morning. This was news to Preston, and apparently to Henry as well, whose face flushed with anger. "You went to the doctor." "Without my permission. I insisted, Mrs. Wilkins said firmly. Head injuries can be serious. Henry looked from Mrs. Wilkins to Darcy, then to Preston, clearly calculating his next move. Finally, he forced a smile. Of course, your health comes first, my dear. Take the time you need. He backed down the steps toward his carriage. But remember, Darcy, you're still my wife. That hasn't changed. After he drove away, Darcy released a shuddering breath. Mrs. Wilkins patted her shoulder before tactfully retreating inside, leaving Darcy and Preston alone again. Dr. Mills didn't actually examine me, Darcy admitted. Mrs. Wilkins made that up to buy me time. Clever woman, Preston said, sitting back down. So what will you do with this time? Darcy looked at him, vulnerability and determination warring in her expression. I'm leaving Twin Falls, she said quietly. As soon as I can make arrangements. I have a cousin in Denver who might take me in. The news hit Preston harder than he expected. You're running. I'm surviving, she countered. There's no future for me here, Preston. Henry will never let me go willingly, and even if I could divorce him, which no court around here would grant, I have nothing of my own. Everything I inherited from my parents is in his name. Preston wanted to argue, to offer solutions, but he recognized the truth in her words. The deck was stacked against her in Twin Falls. When will you go? He asked instead. I don't know yet. I need to send a letter to my cousin first, make sure she can take me in, and I need to gather enough money for the stage fare. She hesitated. I'd appreciate it if you kept this between us, of course. Preston stood reluctantly. I should go. I don't want to cause you more trouble. Darcy rose as well, suddenly looking small and vulnerable. Thank you, Preston, not just for yesterday, but for today, for keeping your promise. On impulse, Preston took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gentle kiss. I'll check on you when I can, he said, releasing her hand. Be careful, Darcy. As he walked away, Preston felt as if he were leaving something essential behind. In just 2 days, this woman had gotten under his skin in a way no one ever had before. The thought of her leaving Twin Falls created a hollow feeling in his chest, but he respected her decision. She was right, staying in Twin Falls with a husband like Porter was a dangerous proposition. Still, something told him their story wasn't over yet. 3 days passed, during which Preston threw himself into his work at the Nelson Ranch. The physical labor helped clear his mind, though thoughts of Darcy were never far away. He rode into town each evening, sometimes catching a glimpse of her on Mrs. Wilkins's porch, sometimes just reassuring himself that Porter's carriage wasn't parked outside. On the 4th day, as Preston was breaking a young horse in the corral, Thomas Nelson approached the fence. You've got away with the difficult ones, Nelson observed as the horse responded to Preston's gentle but firm guidance. Just need to understand what they're afraid of, Preston replied, guiding the horse to the fence. Then show them there's nothing to fear. Nelson nodded thoughtfully. Heard you had a run-in with Henry Porter. Preston dismounted, leading the horse out of the corral. News travels fast. Small town. Nelson followed Preston to the stable. Porter's not someone to cross lightly, so I've been told. Preston began removing the horse's tack. You know him well, Nelson leaned against the stable door. Well enough. He holds the mortgage on half the businesses in town, including a portion of my ranch. Man's got his fingers in everything, including the law. Sheriff Buchanan's mostly straight, but he knows which side his bread is buttered on. Deputy Warren is Porter's man through and through. Nelson studied Preston carefully. This about his wife. Preston focused on brushing down the horse, just trying to understand the lay of the land. Mrs. Porter, Darcy, she was Jacob Palmer's daughter. Jacob and I were friends. He'd turn in his grave if he knew how Porter treats her. Nelson sighed. But that's the way of things sometimes. A woman's lot can be hard out here. Doesn't make it right, Preston said, more sharply than he intended. No, Nelson agreed. It doesn't. He pushed away from the door. Anyway, I came to tell you we're driving cattle to the north pasture tomorrow. Be ready at dawn. After Nelson left, Preston finished tending to the horse, his mind working over what he'd learned. If Porter held mortgages on so many properties, perhaps there were records that could help Darcy reclaim some of her inheritance. It was a slim hope, but worth investigating. That evening, Preston rode into town earlier than usual. Instead of heading to the boarding house, he made his way to the small law office near the courthouse. James Harper was Twin Falls's only attorney, a young man who had hung his shingle just 2 years prior. The office was still open, with a lamp burning in the window. Preston tied his horse and entered to find Harper at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers. "Can I help you?" Harper asked, looking up from his work. "I hope so," Preston replied. "I need some legal advice." Harper gestured to a chair. "Have a seat, Mr. Nathans, Preston Nathans." Recognition flickered in the lawyer's eyes. "Ah, the cowboy who interfered with the Porters. Word gets around." Preston sat. "That's actually what I want to talk to you about. Hypothetically speaking, if a woman's inheritance is transferred to her husband upon marriage, is there any legal way for her to reclaim it?" Harper leaned back in his chair, studying Preston. "Hypothetically speaking, it depends on the terms of the original inheritance. Was there a will? Were there conditions? I don't know the specifics. Without specifics, it's hard to give advice." Harper tapped his fingers on the desk. "But generally speaking, once property passes to a husband, it's legally his to control. That's the law. Even if the husband is abusive." Harper's expression grew cautious. "Mr. Nathans, I should tell you that Henry Porter is a client of mine. I can't discuss his affairs, hypothetical or otherwise." Preston wasn't surprised. "I understand. Let me ask a different question then. If a woman wanted to leave her husband, what legal options would she have? Divorce is difficult to obtain in Idaho territory, especially for a woman. She would need to prove extreme cruelty, which the courts set a high bar for, or abandonment for at least 1 year. Harper hesitated. "But even if granted, she would likely receive nothing in the settlement except perhaps a small maintenance." It was as Preston had feared. The law offered Darcy little protection and even less hope of financial independence. "Thank you for your time," Preston said, standing. Harper rose as well. "Mr. Nathans, a word of advice: be careful about coming between a man and his wife, even with the best intentions. The law won't look kindly on it, and neither will Porter." Preston nodded and left, his frustration mounting. Every avenue seemed blocked. If Darcy couldn't reclaim her inheritance and couldn't get a divorce with a fair settlement, then perhaps leaving for Denver was indeed her best option. As he rode toward the boarding house, Preston noticed a commotion down the street. A crowd had gathered outside the Silverado saloon, and raised voices carried through the evening air. Curious, Preston directed his horse that way. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. Darcy stood on the boardwalk, her arm in Henry's tight grip, her face a mask of fear. Henry was berating her loudly, clearly having had too much to drink. "Thought you could hide from me," Henry was saying. "You're my wife. You belong at home, not gossiping with that widow and entertaining cowboys." "Henry, please," Darcy pleaded, trying to pull away. "You're hurting me." "I'll show you hurt if you don't start behaving like a proper wife." Preston was off his horse in an instant, pushing through the crowd. "Let her go, Porter," he called. Henry's head whipped around, his face contorting with rage when he saw Preston. "You." He shoved Darcy roughly against the saloon wall and turned to face Preston. "This is your doing, filling my wife's head with ideas." "The only idea I have," Preston said evenly, "is that a man shouldn't mistreat his wife." "She is mine," Henry spat. "Mine to do with as I please." Preston took a step forward. "Not anymore." Henry reached into his coat and pulled out a small derringer. The crowd gasped and backed away, leaving a circle of space around the two men and Darcy. "Henry, no," Darcy cried. "Stay out of this, Darcy," Henry snarled, his gun trained on Preston. "I'm going to teach this drifter a lesson about respecting other men's property." Preston didn't reach for his own weapon. "Is this how you solve your problems, Porter? Pulling a gun when you don't get your way?" "You're nothing," Henry said, his voice slurred but his hand steady. "A nobody passing through. You think anyone here will care if I put a bullet in you? They'll call it self-defense." "They'll call it murder," came a new voice, and Sheriff Buchanan pushed through the crowd, his own gun drawn. "Put it down, Henry." For a tense moment, Henry's gun remained pointed at Preston, then with a curse he lowered it. "This man was threatening me, Sheriff," Henry said, adopting an injured tone. "I was merely protecting myself." "That's not what I saw," Sheriff Buchanan replied. "What I saw was you manhandling your wife and drawing on an unarmed man." The sheriff looked around at the crowd. "Anyone see differently?" There was a murmur of dissent. No one was willing to contradict the sheriff's account, not even those who might have been sympathetic to Porter. "I'm taking you in to cool off for the night," the sheriff said, approaching Henry cautiously. "This is outrageous," Henry protested as the sheriff took his arm. "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Sheriff Buchanan said grimly. "And that's why you're getting a night in jail instead of worse." He looked at Darcy. "Mrs. Porter, I suggest you return to Mrs. Wilkins's for now." Henry's face was purple with rage. "Darcy, if you're not home when I get out tomorrow, I swear That's enough," the sheriff said sharply, leading Henry away. The crowd began to disperse, some shooting curious glances at Darcy and Preston, others looking away in embarrassment. Preston approached Darcy, who was trembling against the wall. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He found me at the general store. I was buying paper to write to my cousin." She took a shuddering breath. "Preston, I can't stay in Twin Falls anymore, not even for a few more days. He'll kill me when he gets out." Preston glanced in the direction the sheriff had taken Porter. "He won't touch you again, I promise." "You can't be with me every minute," Darcy said, her voice breaking. "And neither can Mrs. Wilkins. Henry has friends everywhere." Preston knew she was right. Even with Porter in jail overnight, he had too many allies in town to be held for long, and his humiliation tonight would only fuel his rage. "The stage to Denver doesn't leave until Tuesday," Darcy continued, wringing her hands. "That's 4 days away." Preston made a swift decision. "You don't have to wait for the stage, I can take you." Darcy stared at him. "What? I have a good horse. We can leave tonight, ride to Junction City. It's only 30 miles south. They have a rail connection to Denver. But your job at the Nelson Ranch, Mr. Nelson will understand." Preston touched her arm lightly. "Darcy, you're not safe here. If you want to leave, I'll help you." She searched his face, hope and fear warring in her eyes. "Why would you do this? Risk everything for a woman you barely know?" Preston didn't have a rational answer, only the certainty that leaving Darcy to face Porter's wrath was unthinkable. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I want to." Something passed between them then, a connection deeper than words could express. Darcy nodded slowly. "All right, I need to get my things from Mrs. Wilkins's." "I'll meet you there in an hour," Preston said. "Pack light, we'll travel fast." As Darcy hurried toward the boarding house, Preston headed to the livery to prepare his horse. He knew helping Darcy escape would make him Porter's enemy for life, but he was already that. What mattered now was getting her to safety. An hour later, Preston waited in the shadows behind Mrs. Wilkins's boarding house. The night was dark, with clouds obscuring the moon, which would work to their advantage. He had his horse ready, with supplies for 2 days' travel secured to the saddle. The back door opened, and Darcy slipped out, carrying a small carpet bag. She had changed into a simple dark dress and had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Ready?" Preston whispered. She nodded, her face pale but determined in the dim light. "Mrs. Wilkins gave us some food for the journey." Preston took her bag and secured it to the horse. Then he helped her mount, settling her sideways on the saddle before swinging up behind her. The closeness was intimate, her back pressed against his chest, but there was no time to dwell on it. "We'll take the back roads," Preston said softly. "Stay off the main trail until we're well away from town." They rode in silence through the outskirts of Twin Falls, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the few people still out at this late hour. Darcy was tense against him, her body rigid with anxiety. "Relax," he murmured near her ear. "We'll be fine." She nodded but didn't speak. Preston guided the horse onto a narrow trail that led south through the scrubland. Once they were beyond the last buildings of Twin Falls, he urged the animal into a steady canter. The night air was cool, the vast expanse of stars gradually becoming visible as the clouds thinned. Preston could feel Darcy slowly relaxing against him as the miles passed, and no pursuit materialized. After 2 hours of hard riding, Preston slowed the horse to a walk to let it rest. They had covered a good distance, and the lights of Twin Falls were far behind them. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Better than I expected," Darcy replied, her voice stronger now that they were away from town. "I've never done anything like this before, run away in the night with a cowboy." She laughed softly, the sound filling Preston with warmth. "That or stand up to Henry at all. I've been so afraid for so long I forgot what it feels like to make my own choices." Preston understood. He had seen it before, people trapped by fear until they could no longer imagine freedom. "You're doing fine," he said. "Junction City is still a fair distance, but we should make it by midday tomorrow if we keep a good pace." They continued through the night, alternating between walking and cantering, stopping occasionally to rest the horse and stretch their legs. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable. Preston was acutely aware of Darcy's presence, the scent of her hair, the warmth of her body against his, the trust she had placed in him. As dawn broke, they stopped by a small creek to water the horse and eat some of the food Mrs. Wilkins had provided. Sitting on a rock watching Darcy splash water on her face, Preston was struck by how natural this felt, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "What will you do in Denver?" he asked. Darcy dried her face with a corner of her shawl. "My cousin runs a millinery shop. She's offered me work before. It's not much, but it's a start." "And what about Porter? Will you seek a divorce?" she sighed, sitting beside him on the rock. "Eventually, perhaps, but first I need to establish myself, find my footing." She looked at him curiously. "What about you? Will you go back to Twin Falls after you've delivered me to Junction City?" Preston had been pondering that question himself. "Not right away. Porter will be looking for both of us. Better to lie low for a while." He paused. "There's ranch work to be had all over these territories." "I'll find something." Darcy's expression fell slightly. "I see, unless—" Preston began, then hesitated. "Unless," he met her eyes. "Unless you'd want me to come to Denver just until you're settled." The hope that flared in her eyes made his heart race. "You would do that?" "I told you I'd stay right there," he reminded her. "I meant it." Darcy's hand found his, her fingers cool against his sun-weathered skin. "I'd like that very much, Preston." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Preston found himself leaning toward her, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. Darcy's eyes fluttered closed as his lips met hers in a gentle kiss. It was brief, tender, a promise rather than a demand. When Preston pulled back, Darcy's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "We should get moving," he said softly. "Still a long way to Junction City." They continued their journey as the sun rose higher in the sky. The landscape changed gradually, the scrubland giving way to more varied terrain with scattered trees and rolling hills. By mid-morning, they had covered a substantial distance, and Preston estimated they were more than halfway to Junction City. Then, as they crested a hill, Preston heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the distant thunder of multiple horses at full gallop. "Riders coming," he said, turning in the saddle to look behind them. Dust clouds rose on the horizon, Darcy's body tensed against him. "Henry, possibly?" Preston urged their horse forward. "Let's not wait to find out." They pushed harder now, the horse responding gamely despite the long night of travel. But Preston knew they couldn't outrun fresh mounts for long. He scanned the terrain, looking for options. About a mile ahead, he spotted a stand of trees along what appeared to be another creek bed. "There," he said, pointing. "We'll make for those trees." They galloped toward the small grove, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. As they reached the trees, Preston helped Darcy quickly dismount and led the horse deep into the cover of the foliage. "Stay here with the horse," he instructed, drawing his pistol. I'm going to see who's following us." "Be careful," Darcy whispered, fear evident in her eyes. Preston made his way cautiously to the edge of the grove, finding a position where he could see the approach without being easily spotted. The riders were closer now, 5 men, with Deputy Warren in the lead and Henry Porter just behind him. Preston cursed under his breath. They must have ridden hard through the night to catch up so quickly. Porter must have been released from jail early, or perhaps had never been locked up at all. The riders slowed as they neared the trees, obviously having lost sight of their quarry. Preston watched as Warren raised a hand, bringing the group to a halt about 200 yards from the grove. "They're in those trees," Porter said, his voice carrying on the still air. "I know it." "We'll flush them out," Warren replied, drawing his gun. "No need to rush in. They're trapped." Preston retreated back to where Darcy waited. "It's Porter and Warren," he confirmed. "3 others with them. They know we're here." Darcy's face paled. "What do we do?" Preston considered their options. The grove wasn't large enough to hide in for long, and they were outnumbered and outgunned. Fighting would be a last resort. "There's a creek running through these trees," he said. "If we follow it south, it might give us cover to slip away while they're surrounding the grove." They led the horse quietly through the trees, following the small creek that cut through the center of the stand. The water was shallow, which would help mask their tracks. Preston kept his gun ready, every sense alert for sounds of pursuit. The creek led them to the southern edge of the grove, where the trees thinned out. Beyond was open country with rolling hills but little cover. Preston paused, studying the terrain. "If we make a run for it, they'll see us immediately," he said. "But if we stay here, they'll find us soon enough." Darcy looked around desperately. "Could we double back, try to slip past them to the north?" "Too risky. They've probably got the northern edge covered by now." Preston made a swift decision. "I'm going to create a diversion. When I do, you take the horse and ride south as fast as you can. There's another stand of trees about 2 miles in that direction. Make for it and I'll catch up with you." "I'm not leaving you," Darcy protested. "You have to." "It's your best chance." Preston took her hand. "I'll be right behind you, I promise." Before she could argue further, shots rang out from the northern edge of the grove. Warren's voice called out, "Nathans, we know you're in there. Come out with Mrs. Porter and no one needs to get hurt." Preston squeezed Darcy's hand. "Get ready. When you hear shooting from the east side, that's your signal to go." "Preston," he silenced her with a quick, fierce kiss. "Trust me." Then he was gone, moving silently through the trees toward the eastern edge of the grove. Darcy stood frozen, the horse's reins clutched in her trembling hands. Torn between fear and the desperate need to believe in Preston's plan, minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Then a barrage of gunfire erupted from the eastern side of the grove, followed by shouts and the sound of men running. Darcy hesitated only a moment before mounting the horse and urging it out of the trees, heading south across the open country. She kept low in the saddle, pushing the animal to its limits, her heart pounding with fear for Preston and for herself. The distance to the next stand of trees seemed impossibly vast. Darcy expected at any moment to hear hoofbeats behind her or a bullet whizzing past. But she reached the trees without incident, guiding the horse into their shelter before dismounting and listening intently. The distant sound of sporadic gunfire still came from the grove they had left. Darcy paced anxiously, torn between the instinct to flee further and the need to wait for Preston as promised. Then the shooting stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Darcy strained to see what was happening, but the distance was too great to make out details. Minutes stretched into a half hour with no sign of Preston. Darcy's fear grew with each passing moment. Had he been captured? Wounded? Worse, just as she was considering the unthinkable returning to look for him, Darcy spotted a lone figure moving across the open ground toward her position. The figure was on foot, moving at a steady jog, and even at a distance, she recognized Preston's gait. Relief flooded through her. She led the horse to the edge of the trees to meet him, fighting the urge to run out into the open. When Preston finally reached her, he was dusty and winded but unharmed. "They've gone," he said, catching his breath. "Heading back north." "All of them?" Darcy asked incredulously. Preston nodded, a grim smile on his face. "I managed to get to their horses while they were searching the grove." "Scattered them. Warren and his men had to go after them on foot." Porter was furious. "You could have been killed," Darcy said, torn between relief and anger. "But I wasn't." Preston took the reins from her. "We need to keep moving. They'll regroup eventually." They continued southward, Preston now riding behind Darcy to give the horse less weight to carry in front. The day grew hotter as noon approached, the sun beating down mercilessly. Both were exhausted from the night's journey and the morning's excitement, but the need to reach Junction City kept them going. By early afternoon, they crested a hill and saw the town spread out before them in the valley below Junction City, with its cluster of buildings, church spire, and most importantly, the railroad station. "We made it," Darcy whispered, almost afraid to believe it. Preston squeezed her waist gently. "Not quite yet. Let's get you on that train first." They rode into Junction City cautiously, alert for any sign of trouble, but the town was peaceful, going about its ordinary business with no indication that a drama was unfolding within its limits. At the train station, they learned that the next train to Denver would depart in 2 hours. Preston purchased a ticket for Darcy, using some of the money he had saved from his brief time at the Nelson Ranch. While they waited, they found a small cafe where they could rest and eat. Sitting across from each other at a corner table, away from the windows, they finally had a moment to contemplate what they had been through and what lay ahead. "I'll send word to Mrs. Wilkins once I'm settled in Denver," Darcy said, sipping her coffee. "Let her know I'm safe." Preston nodded. "That's wise. She was a true friend to you." "One of the few." Darcy studied his face. "You've been more than a friend, Preston. You've risked everything for me. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me." His eyes held hers. "I did what any decent man would do." "No," she said softly. "Most decent men would have walked away after the first confrontation. You stayed. You kept your promise." Preston reached across the table and took her hand. "And I'm still keeping it. I meant what I said about coming to Denver with you." Hope bloomed in Darcy's chest. "You're sure? Your life is here, your work." "My work is wherever I choose to make it, and right now I choose to be where you are." He paused. "If that's what you want." "It is," Darcy said without hesitation. "More than anything." The train whistle sounded, announcing the approaching departure. They gathered their few belongings and made their way to the platform. Preston had arranged to sell his horse to the livery stable, providing them with additional funds for the journey. As the train pulled into the station, billowing steam and screeching to a halt, Darcy felt a mixture of excitement and fear. She was leaving behind everything she had known: her home, her past, the prison her marriage had become. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also freedom. They boarded the train and found seats in a car that was only half full. As the locomotive lurched forward, beginning its journey to Denver, Darcy looked out the window at Junction City receding behind them. "It doesn't seem real," she murmured, "that I'm actually getting away." Preston sat beside her, his solid presence a comfort. "It's real. Porter can't reach you now." "He'll try," Darcy said, fear momentarily shadowing her relief. "He doesn't give up easily, neither do I." Preston's voice was firm. "And in Denver, you'll be just one woman among thousands." "It will be harder for him to find you." Darcy nodded, trying to believe it. As the train picked up speed, carrying them further from Twin Falls with every passing minute, she allowed herself to truly hope for the first time in years. "Tell me about your cousin," Preston said, clearly trying to distract her from her worries. "The one with the millinery shop." "Deanna, she's my mother's niece, a few years older than me. She left Twin Falls about 5 years ago after her fiancé died in a mining accident." Darcy smiled at the memory of her vivacious cousin. "Everyone thought she was mad to go off on her own, but she built a good life in Denver. Her letters are always full of the city's excitement, and she'll take you in. Yes. She's offered before when things with Henry first turned bad." Darcy's smile faded. I was too afraid to accept then, too afraid of the unknown. And now, Darcy looked at Preston, at the kindness and strength in his face, and felt a surge of courage. Now I'm more afraid of staying trapped than I am of whatever comes next. The train journey to Denver took the rest of the day and through the night. Darcy and Preston talked for hours, learning about each other in a way they hadn't had time for during their flight from Twin Falls. Preston told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, losing his parents to a fever when he was 16, and making his way as a cowboy ever since. Darcy shared memories of her childhood in Twin Falls, her parents' loving but troubled marriage, and how her father's business partnership with Henry Porter had evolved into an arranged marriage after her father's health began to fail. "I thought I could make it work," Darcy admitted as night fell and the train clacked rhythmically through the darkness. "Henry was charming when he wanted to be, and my father believed it was the best way to secure my future." "You couldn't have known how it would turn out," Preston said. "Perhaps I should have. There were signs even before we married. His temper, the way he spoke to his servants." She shook her head. "But I was young and thought marriage would soften him. Instead, it just gave him power over you." "Yes." Darcy leaned her head against the window, watching the moonlit landscape pass by. "The first time he hit me was 6 months after our wedding. I had forgotten to order a special wine he wanted for a dinner party. He apologized afterward, promised it would never happen again. But it did. Again and again, each time with a new excuse, a new promise that things would change." Darcy turned to Preston. "What would have happened if you hadn't stepped between us that day?" Preston considered the question. "I'd like to think someone else would have. Mrs. Wilkins, perhaps, or Sheriff Buchanan." "I don't think so," Darcy said quietly. "Everyone in Twin Falls knew what was happening. They chose not to see it until you forced them to look." Preston took her hand, his touch gentle yet reassuring. "Try to rest. Tomorrow you start a new life." Darcy nodded, settling back in her seat. Exhaustion from their escape soon overtook her, and she drifted to sleep with her head against Preston's shoulder. When she awoke, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the landscape outside had changed dramatically. Gone were the vast open spaces of Idaho territory, replaced by the foothills leading to the Rocky Mountains. They were approaching Denver. As the train pulled into the station, Darcy felt a sudden flutter of nerves. This was it, the new beginning she had both longed for and feared. She smoothed her wrinkled dress and tried to tidy her hair. "Ready?" Preston asked as the train came to a stop. Darcy took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." They disembarked into the bustling Denver station. After the quiet of Twin Falls, the city was overwhelming crowds of people, noise, movement in every direction. Preston kept a protective hand at Darcy's elbow as they navigated through the terminal. "Deanna's shop is on Larimer Street," Darcy said, consulting the address she had memorized from her cousin's letters. "We should find a cab." They secured a hackney cab outside the station, and as they rode through the streets of Denver, Darcy marveled at the city's energy and size. Twin Falls, with its single main street and handful of businesses, seemed like a tiny outpost in comparison. The millinery shop, when they found it, was a charming establishment with elaborate hats displayed in the window. A bell tinkled as they entered, and a woman looked up from arranging a display. "Deanna," Darcy called, her face lighting up at the sight of her cousin. Deanna Porter was a striking woman in her early 30s, with the same honey blonde hair as Darcy but with a confident bearing that spoke of independence. Her surprise quickly turned to joy as she recognized her visitor. "Darcy, my goodness!" She rushed forward to embrace her cousin. "What on earth are you doing in Denver? Your letter said you were thinking of coming, but I didn't expect you so soon." "It's a long story," Darcy said, returning the hug with equal warmth. "Deanna, this is Preston Nathans. He helped me get here." Deanna assessed Preston with a shrewd gaze before offering her hand. "Any friend of Darcy's is welcome, but I suspect there's more to this than a friendly escort." "Perhaps we could speak somewhere private," Preston suggested. Deanna nodded, locking the shop door and turning the sign to closed. My apartment is upstairs. Come. In Deanna's cozy apartment above the shop, Darcy and Preston took turns explaining the events that had led them to Denver. Deanna listened with growing concern, occasionally interjecting with questions or exclamations of outrage. That monster, she said when they had finished. I always knew Henry Porter was no good, but this. She took Darcy's hands in hers. You should have come to me sooner, cousin. I know, Darcy admitted. I was too ashamed, too afraid. Well, you're here now and you'll stay as long as you need. Both of you, Deanna added, looking at Preston. I have a spare room for Darcy and there's a boarding house next door where Mr. Nathans can stay. That's very kind, Preston said, but I don't want to impose. Once I know Darcy is settled safely, I'll find my own way. Darcy felt a pang at his words. Despite his promise to come to Denver with her, she had feared he might still leave once his self-appointed duty was done. Diana, observing the look that passed between them, smiled slightly. Well, let's not make any hasty decisions. You both need rest and proper meals. Everything else can wait. The next few days passed in a blur of adjustment for Darcy. Deanna's apartment became a haven and her cousin's steady presence a comfort. Deanna insisted that Darcy take time to rest before making any decisions about work or her future. Preston took a room at the boarding house as suggested, but spent most of his days with Darcy, either at the millinery shop or exploring Denver together. His protective instinct remained strong, though he was careful not to hover on their third evening in Denver as they walked back to Deanna's after dinner at a nearby restaurant. Darcy finally asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. What will you do now, Preston? Now that I'm safe in Denver, he was silent for a moment, his stride matching hers along the gaslit street. I told you I'd stay until you're settled. And then, Preston stopped walking, turning to face her. What do you want me to do, Darcy? The directness of his question took her by surprise. I don't know, I have no right to ask anything of you, you've already done so much. That's not what I asked. His eyes held hers steadily. What do you want? Darcy's heart raced. I want you to stay, she admitted softly. Not because you promised or because you feel responsible for me, but because I care for you. Preston's expression softened. I care for you too, Darcy, more than I thought possible in such a short time. But your life is complicated right now. You're still married to Porter, technically, you're just beginning to find your independence. He took her hands in his. I don't want to be another man making decisions for you. Darcy understood his hesitation and respected it. Then let me make this decision. I want you in my life, Preston. However that happens, he smiled, raising one hand to gently touch her cheek. Then I'll stay in Denver, find work here, and we'll see where this leads us day by day. Their kiss was deeper this time, full of promise and growing affection. When they parted, Darcy felt lighter than she had in years, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. Life in Denver settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Deanna taught Darcy the millinery business, and she proved to have a natural talent for design that delighted her cousin. Preston found work at a livery stable, his experience with horses making him a valuable addition to the staff. They saw each other daily, their relationship deepening as they explored the city together and learned more about each other away from the shadow of danger. Preston was unfailingly patient, never pushing Darcy for more than she was ready to give, understanding that she needed time to heal from her marriage to Henry. 2 months after their arrival in Denver, Darcy received a letter forwarded from Mrs. Wilkins in Twin Falls. With trembling hands, she opened it in the privacy of her room, fearing news of Henry's continued rage or threats. Instead, she found a different kind of shock. Henry Porter had died of a heart attack 3 weeks earlier. The letter, written by James Harper, the lawyer, outlined her position as Porter's widow and sole heir, as they had no children. According to Mr. Porter's will, all his properties and business interests revert to you, Harper had written. As his legal widow, you are entitled to his entire estate. Please advise at your earliest convenience how you wish to proceed with these matters. Darcy sat on her bed, the letter clutched in her hand, emotions warring within her: relief, shock. A strange kind of grief, not for the man but for the marriage that had caused so much pain, and finally, a dizzying sense of freedom. When she showed the letter to Preston that evening, his reaction was measured. "How do you feel about this?" he asked. "Overwhelmed," Darcy admitted. "I never expected. I thought I would have to hide from Henry forever, and now to not only be free of him but to inherit everything." She shook her head. "It doesn't seem real." "It's justice," Preston said. "Your father's estate should have been yours all along." "Yes, but now I have decisions to make. Do I go back to Twin Falls, sell everything, try to run the businesses from here?" She looked at him uncertainly. "What would you do?" Preston considered carefully before answering. "I can't tell you what to do, Darcy, but I can tell you that I'll support whatever decision you make." His steadfast support gave Darcy the confidence to make her own choice. After discussing it with both Preston and Deanna, she decided to return briefly to Twin Falls to settle her affairs, with Preston accompanying her for safety and moral support. The journey back to Twin Falls was vastly different from their flight 2 months earlier. They traveled by train and then stage, arriving in town openly and with heads held high. The news of Henry's death and Darcy's return spread quickly, and the reception was mixed. Some were genuinely pleased to see her, others wary of the changes her return might bring to the town's power structure. Mrs. Wilkins welcomed Darcy with open arms, insisting she stay at the boarding house rather than at the Porter mansion. Sheriff Buchanan paid a respectful visit, offering awkward condolences and expressing relief at seeing her well. Over the next 2 weeks, Darcy met with James Harper and other business associates of her late husband. She learned the extent of Henry's holdings, not just the bank, but interests in the mining operations outside town, several commercial properties, and vast tracts of land. "What will you do with it all?" Preston asked one evening as they walked along Twin Falls's Main Street, now transformed in Darcy's eyes from a place of fear to one of possibility. "I'm selling most of it," she replied. "The bank, the mining interests, the mansion. But I'd like to keep some of the land." She glanced at him. "Particularly the property that borders the Nelson Ranch." Preston raised an eyebrow. "Any particular reason? It's good grazing land. Might be perfect for someone who knows cattle and horses." She smiled. "Someone who might want to build something of his own." Preston stopped walking, turning to face her. "Darcy, are you suggesting what I think you are?" "I'm suggesting that I've found something in Denver I never had in Twin Falls: independence, purpose, joy." Her eyes met his. "But I'm also suggesting that we might have a future that includes both places. My millinery designs with Deanna in Denver and perhaps a ranch here that you could run." Preston's face broke into a slow smile. "You've given this some thought." "I have, but it's just an idea." "I wouldn't presume to plan your future." He took her hands in his. "I think it's a fine idea, but there's something I need to ask you first." He dropped to one knee right there on the boardwalk, drawing surprised glances from passers-by. "Darcy Porter, when your mourning period is over and you're ready, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Darcy's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would." Preston rose and pulled her into an embrace, uncaring of the witnesses to their moment. "I promised I'd stay right there," he murmured against her hair. "I intend to keep that promise for the rest of our lives." 1 year later, Darcy Nathans stood on the porch of a newly built ranch house on the property that had once been part of Henry Porter's holdings. The sprawling house overlooked a valley where cattle grazed peacefully and horses ran in a fenced paddock. Inside, Deanna was helping arrange displays of Darcy's latest hat designs, which had become quite popular among the ladies of Twin Falls and surrounding communities. Her millinery business had expanded beyond Denver, with seasonal trips between the 2 locations becoming a regular part of her life. Preston emerged from the barn, dusty from a morning's work, but smiling when he saw his wife. In the year since their marriage, He had established the DN Ranch as a respected operation, with Thomas Nelson as both neighbor and mentor. "The new foal is doing well," he called as he approached, spitting image of his sire. Darcy smiled, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her slightly rounded belly. Another new addition to look forward to. Preston's eyes lit up at the reminder of their coming child. He joined her on the porch, placing a gentle hand over hers. "Are you happy, Darcy?" "With this life we're building?" She looked out over their land, then back to her husband's face, the face of the man who had stepped between her and danger that day in Twin Falls and had stayed right there ever since. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said, and knew it was true. As Preston bent to kiss her, Darcy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From terror to safety, from captivity to freedom, from loneliness to love. The path had not been easy, but standing here now, in the home they had created together, she knew it had been worth every step. And in the years that followed, as their family grew with the birth of first a son and later a daughter, as the DN Ranch prospered and Darcy's design business flourished, the story of how they met became family legend, how a brave cowboy had stepped between a desperate woman and her abusive husband, and had stayed right there, changing both their lives forever.